In your study of reactions, you've classified different types of reactions and you've done lots of lab experiments, and you may have noticed that sometimes reactions are faster and more vigorous and sometimes they're a little slower. So in this lesson, what we're going to do is look at factors that affect the rate of reaction. I have some theories to show you, and then there are 5 factors that I want to have you think about, and we'll just go through each one and I'll show you how they work. Now, when a reaction is going to occur, the collision theory tells us that the way that the molecules run into one another is important. If you look on the top left here, you'll see that for these two molecules, the correct orientation for a collision is that the top molecule has the double bond in the middle. The smaller molecule underneath with the green and white atom have to run into it in a perpendicular way. Collision number 2 on the top right has the smaller molecule backwards, so that collision does not result in a reaction. Collision 3 on the bottom left of this slide shows an end-to-end collision. That's not the proper orientation, so no reaction occurs there. And then finally, collision 4 on the bottom right of this slide shows you a diagonal collision. This also does not result in a reaction occurring. So the orientation of the molecules is important. Now the other thing that's important is not just that the molecules run into each other, but that they have enough energy for the reaction to occur. What this graph actually shows you is the number of particles that have different amounts of energy in a sample. Only those particles with the highest amounts of energy can do the reaction. That's that little green segment on the bottom right of this graph. The rest of the molecules that are under the blue area of this graph do not have the minimum amount of energy necessary for a reaction to occur. So according to the collision theory, the collision orientation and the amount of energy is what decides whether or not a reaction will occur. Now in this reaction diagram, the reactants, the materials you start with, are on the left side of the graph. And that hill that's in the middle is the activation energy. This is the amount of energy that the particles have to have in order for a reaction to occur. So the molecules have to be able to overcome that hill to be able to become a product. It's kind of like a roller coaster. If the roller coaster has enough energy to get all the way to the top of the hill and down the other side, the ride happens. But if the roller coaster doesn't have enough energy to get up and over that first hill, you don't get to ride the roller coaster. So it's the same thing with these molecules. The collisions with only the right amount of energy will do the reaction. So what factors will affect the rate of a reaction? What are things that we could do to increase either the number of collisions so that our chances are better, or to increase the rate of the reaction by looking at changing the activation energy? Alright, so here are those factors. The first one is surface area. If you look at this top diagram, the green substance is being reacted with the red. And the way it is now, only the green particles that are on the edge of that trapezoid shape there can react, because the red molecules can only come into contact with the edges of the green. So when you have that large particle size, there's not a lot of surface area to react. But what you can do is break that green material down into smaller pieces, and then the red molecules can come into contact with many more green particles. It's surface area. The smaller you make the particles, the larger the surface area is, and that just gives more particles exposure and the chance to be reacted. So if you have more particles able to react, you should get a faster reaction. The way that we do this in lab, the way we affect surface area, is to crush or grind up our substance. So if you have something that is in a large chunk of a piece or large particle sized grains, you can grind them up with a mortar and pestle to increase your surface area. The second factor is to add a catalyst. Now in biology, a catalyst is similar to an enzyme. You may remember that a biological enzyme is a material that speeds up a chemical reaction. A catalyst does exactly the same thing. We're just not in a living system in this course, so it's not called an enzyme. But here's how a catalyst works. If you look at the reaction pathway on the right, the regular pathway is the blue one. But when we add a catalyst, the catalyst causes the activation energy requirement to be less than it normally would. So the catalyst provides a different path for the reactants to become products, and it makes it easier. So by adding a catalyst and lowering the energy requirement, you should create a faster rate of reaction. The third factor is temperature. Now in this graph, you see that the number of particles that can do this reaction are on the very right-hand side of the graph. This is the same graph we looked at a few slides back. If you increase the temperature, you're going to shift that whole curve to the right. Temperature gives the particles extra kinetic energy, and by having more kinetic energy, they're going to move around more, they're going to have more energy, so it's more likely that they'll do the reaction. So remember that the higher the temperature, the more the kinetic energy the particles will have. That should speed up your reaction. The fourth factor is concentration. Now, when you look at these two microscopes, is what I like to think of them as. The one on the left, there are some red and white molecules, and there's a yellow molecule. And on the right, you see the same solution, but it has a different concentration. Which one of these solutions do you think will react faster? Well, the one on the right is the correct guess. Because there are more yellow molecules in the solution on the right, you have a greater chance of those collisions happening and the molecules forming products. So just by probability, having a higher concentration allows you to have a faster rate of reaction because the chances are more likely that you will have good collisions between your molecules. Now the last factor is the nature of reactants. The nature of the reactants is not something that we can necessarily change about a substance. It just means that some materials are more reactive than others. The example that I have for you is called a sacrificial anode. A sacrificial anode is when a more reactive metal sacrifices itself to protect a less reactive metal. So what happens in this situation, it's the hull of a boat. Boat hulls, you know, when they stay in the water over time, can corrode and become damaged. But they're made now with sacrificial anodes on the hull of the boat so that that anode will react and protect the hull of the boat instead. This is also used in water heaters and in pipelines. The picture on the bottom shows a sacrificial anode. The one on the top of the picture is a new one, and the one on the bottom of the picture is one that has been on a boat or in a water heater for quite some time. It reacts with the water around it so that the material you're interested in preserving does not react. So those are the 5 factors. You want to know each one of the factors and how the change affects the rate. For example, increasing temperature increases the rate of reaction. Adding a catalyst increases the rate of reaction, and so on. So just make sure you review those rates before we do our lab, and I'll see you then.